Forgot. But I think it's becoming relatively commonplace. But what you may not think about is that it's also pretty awful for the presenter too. I'm here in my shed talking to my computer screen, and I have no idea who's out there and who's listening, right? In a normal presentation, you can make eye contact. You might even get questions during your talk. You can certainly be thinking about the questions you're going to get based off of how you're receiving it on their faces. Are they happy? Are they not sad? How are they receiving the information? All of that is essentially removed with some poor substitutes of little video icons that we can see. So now contrast that with the traditional way in which we give talks. So the best talk I ever gave in my life for sure was when I spoke at TEDx Salt Lake City. The reason why is because it was completely choreographed. For about 6 months, we practiced. I must have given that talk 100 times. And every little movement, where you place your hands, where you step, how you enumerate things, every little bit, the volume of your voice is completely scripted. And it's scripted because it's effective. It's undeniably a more effective way to communicate when you can actually make eye contact, look at people, deliver your points in different ways like that. And so that has the risk of being lost when we move to this online format. So if that's lost, if we're just seeing the content and not getting the delivery, then I think we're all wasting our times. In fact, if that's the case, if the audience really doesn't see you and interact with you, then they could just read your paper. And yet if you're there in person, you can deliver a much more convincing speech. So what are ways that we've done to try and meet in the middle, still present while also being able to do so remotely? There's a couple things that we've tried. I'll show you the first thing I've done when I'm teaching my classes. This is what I do. It's a video within a video. It's not ideal. It's pretty much what Zoom can do right now. I could share my screen right now, and you could still see my little video icon up on the side somewhere. And that's essentially what we have here. You have a video of yourself in one corner, but it's kind of small. And then you're still sort of like trying to point. I suppose if you wanted to, you could be like, and here in this slide, you can see, but it's not ideal. It's not very ideal at all. So what other options do we have? Well, you could do the side by side where you actually have your screen and your slides right next to each other. But in some ways, this is the worst of both worlds because both are still relatively small. The slides in particular aren't going to be the right size for what you're trying to present. Now, what does Zoom do? Zoom has options. You can do this. This was from our fall meeting from the dean. As he was presenting, this is what my default setting showed me. It showed a video of him and it showed me his slides over here. But what's unfortunate about Zoom is that Zoom doesn't let you control what the audience sees. Like, do you want it side by side or do you have something else? For example, this was another option I could do. With a click of a button, I as the viewer could do this. And now look at all these wonderful people who I can wonder what's going on in their background and what they're doing and who they are and if I know them. Or it could go to this, right? All of these are completely different. But the point is, you don't get to control that when you're using Zoom in its default settings. So there's got to be a better way. I think that there is a better way, and I'm trying to show it by the way that I'm giving this talk today. If you'll notice, I'm jumping, I hope it's seamlessly, and you guys will be the judges, but I think it's relatively seamlessly. I'm jumping between my camera, which you're seeing, of me giving an actual real life presentation where I'm looking at you the best I can, and where I can jump to my slides. So I think that this is the best way to do it, is to actively control this, because this is what we do in a conference setting. In a conference setting, you stand next to a slide, you're at a pulpit, you might have your laser pointer or a yardstick or something, but the point is when you want to draw attention to a figure, you look at it yourself, you don't turn your back on the audience, but you do rotate yourself to the figure, you describe it, and then you come back like this, and with your body's motions, turning back to them and moving your hands back towards yourself, you may not realize it, but we are all drawing attention back to ourselves, which is the point, because they came to hear you speak, not to look at your slides, or we could have done that from home, right? Doing this format where I'm able to jump from video to the slides and then back to the video is as close an approximation for what we can get in the conference setting as possible. So how is this possible? This is not an easy, well, it's not difficult, but it's not the standard way to use Zoom. Here's how you do it. In Zoom, rather than presenting your entire screen, what you want to do is present a portion of your screen. Right here, this green box, that can be moved around. You can make it bigger or smaller, but that is what I'm choosing to present on my screen right now, is some portion of it, right? Which means that all this region over here, I can put things like my participant list, I can put my notes, I can put other information or prompts that you might need. And then the best part of all is you also have your video running. You turn off the default Zoom video, and instead you turn on your video, and you can just Alt Tab and switch between the two. So I can show my slide, and when necessary, I can jump back to myself. So the next slide here shows, here's what it looks like when I Alt Tab over. Again, I still have this space where I can put my notes or anything else, and then this is what you're going to be seeing when it's in that stage, right? What's great about this is that you can put your show notes here, like whatever you're going to be talking about. For example, I have my notes telling me the rough outline of what I'm going to be covering this talk. So I have right there saying, now transition to talking about backgrounds, right? So let's do that. I can talk about backgrounds, and as you've seen, there's actually some pretty funny videos. This guy did a parody where he says, I know that you professors aren't home and your students are missing out on the true experience of interacting with their professor and their audience. So he makes his living room look like his audience. But the truth is not too far from the joke here. Most of us have ridiculous backgrounds in our homes, and you can't help but be distracted by it. You're looking at their pictures, maybe their bike or whatever else. It tends to be a little bit distracting. So my suggestion to you, as with one of the most common suggestions with giving presentation, is to maximize your signal and minimize your noise. Things that you want them to see, like your facial expressions, motions, body language, make sure that comes through, but minimize the noise. I do that here by stealing my son's blanket and hanging up a very simple, very inexpensive backdrop. You can do this on lots of different things very easily. For example, this is how I've got, oh, by the way, and don't do the virtual backgrounds. I think unless you're just having a chat with somebody, if you're actually presenting, I think they're more distracting than they are helpful. So I would avoid the virtual backgrounds. They're moving around, which is distracting to the eye, and then they do funny things to your head, which make it look weird. So I don't suggest it. This is what I did. So here's where I am currently standing right now. I'm standing here, and I've got a background which is made of my son's sheet, because it's the one that I had on hand. You don't have to spend basically any money on this. You can hang it on a bookshelf or on your wall. You can tack it to the wall, and you've got, next thing you know, a very effective background that does the job really well, and is much less distracting than you looking at my beekeeping suit or my climbing gear or whatever else, right? So create an inexpensive backdrop is one suggestion I have for you. Next thing is, the default way of doing Zoom that you're all probably doing right now is to set it on a table, and then you're standing a little bit taller than that, or sitting taller than that, and it's looking up at you. The problem with this is that looking up at someone is not the most flattering thing in the world. As you can see, this is not ideal. It's much more natural, and it feels more human-like to be roughly eye to eye with them. Now, the other thing you notice I've done here is I'm standing up. I can like jump, I can move right here. Why is this better? When you stand up, immediately your posture is better. Your shoulders go back, you portray much more confidence. It's a much better way to go. So it's easy to do. Here in my setup, all I had to do to fix this was move my camera higher, right? Here I've got this highly sophisticated system for moving my camera up higher. And next thing you know, I'm looking directly at the camera, and it's a far better setup. And you don't have to spend a lot of money to get this. I'm still using the built-in video camera on my laptop. It's just, I think, a better overall performance. So I would suggest to stand, but it's up to you what you'd like to do there. Well, what else can we do? Another suggestion I heard on these was to control your lighting. So what's the lighting situation here? I've got right in front of me natural light, which is great. Where possible, natural light works awesome. It should be straight on. Side light, where half your face is dark and half it is really bright, isn't ideal. But you do want to control it. Now, the one problem I have in my current setup is, if you notice, this is west facing. And so at what time are we at? 4:30 p.m. or whatever, I have really bad glare coming right in that window. So you need to control for that. Think about changing lighting conditions. For me, what I have to use is a diffuser. So there's lots of options here. You don't need to go crazy and buy anything fancy. I just hung a towel on my window, and that diffuses the light so you don't get harsh shadows. It actually is doing some funny things to the color, but it's not the end of the world, okay? So controlling your lighting. What else can we do? I think that's most of the main tips for actually the delivering over Zoom. And I think the most important thing you can do is learn how to do slides within a slide like this. So it's a little more seamless to talk about what you're presenting and then bring it back to you where they'll actually hopefully be paying attention a little bit better. Okay, let's switch to our next topic, which is the decisions that you need to make ahead of time. I think this is one of the most commonly overlooked things that scientists do. I think that because most scientists and engineers are poor communicators, that they set the bar really low, which means that when we go to conferences, we kind of meet that bar. We've seen so many bad talks where people just ramble on, where they're not even looking at you. They're reading their slides exactly off their completely monotone voice, and it's not interesting or well thought of, that we just kind of do the same thing. But the fact is, you should really be answering these a series of questions ahead of time. Here's the questions I think that you should think about before you give your talk. First is, who is my audience? If you don't know ahead of time, you should find out. If somebody says, I need you to give a presentation, your very next question should be, who am I speaking to, right? I really hope that's your next question. And then your next question should be, well, what do they already know? What level am I going to meet them at? And then the most important perhaps of all is, what do I want them to come away with? When you give a talk, you should have some sort of goal. My goal today is to make you all at least rethink the way that you've been giving Zoom presentations, and even better, change the way that you've been doing them, make a change, or decide to at least look into making a change. Those are my goals. And so I'm going to craft my entire presentation around those goals. But if you never sat down and asked, what's my goal, then you're not going to give a very effective talk. So most of the times when you go to conferences, these virtual conferences, which are becoming a thing now, sadly, what are the goals of you going to those, right? What do you think the goal is? I mean, one could be, you want people to know who you are in the work you do, right? Maybe they want them to hire you as a postdoc or in industry, right? Maybe your goal is for them to download your paper and read it, right? But you need to think about what your goal is, because you're going to craft your message differently because of that, okay? So most of this is just preparation and forethought ahead of time. There's no skills here. I think it's just being conscious of it and doing it. Next up, we have this, okay, is effective figures. I'm going to talk for a minute about what I think constitute effective figures, and realize that everything I'm going to describe here largely comes from other people who are experts in the matter. For example, Jean-Luc Doumont. If you do nothing else from this entire seminar, please write down tiny.cc/Doumont. That was a tiny link that will take you to one of his YouTube videos where you'll see him describe a lot of what I'm describing, but much better. So I really suggest you check that out. But I'm also taking slides from, well, examples from Ram Seshadri's group, my postdoc advisor, who does a great job. So with that, with those recognitions in place, let me just say, let's talk about graphical excellence and effective figures to start with. What is graphical excellence and a good figure? In my opinion, graphical excellence is taking a figure and portraying a complicated idea in a way that is simple, precise, and efficient, right? So here I've got an example of what I think is a good figure. In this figure, you see, first off, lots and lots going on. So generally speaking, a simple, easy to digest figure is a good one. And yet here I'm showing you one with like 4 or 5 different measurements, all done as a function of temperature. There's lines going everywhere. Why do I think this is an effective figure? Well, because let's go back to the point why we wrote that paper. When we wrote that paper, we had a goal in mind. We wanted to convince the field that there was a new structure that existed in this material. What was known, if you look at this figure, with these vertical lines, these dashed lines here, there were 2 magnetic transitions that were known in this material, and we had investigated it, and we found evidence of a 3rd one. So by putting all 4 of these things together, you can see that at 20 degrees, yeah, it does look like something's happening. And so you've got 4 or 5 different measurements that all seem to suggest that something's happening there. Again, it took a complicated subject like there's an existence of a 3rd phase, and I hopefully showed it in a relatively simple way. But let's dig into this and look at some more examples of good figures and bad figures. So one thing to start with might be fonts. And the very fact that I called it a font tells you that I don't take this super duper seriously. You know, people call them typefaces and all that, whatever else. I think the biggest thing you need to think about here is serif versus sans serif. When is the right time to use either? So serif is when it has the little feet, like this, and sans serif does not. And I think there's a time and a place to use both. For example, the little feet thing are a guide for the eye. So if you're reading a big block of text, the little feet, the serif is going to help you. So let's show it exactly in an example. Here on the right, we have a serif font, Minion Pro, and it makes it easier to read these big blocks of text without losing yourself as you go across it. On the other hand, the sans serif is not like it's super hard to read, but it's not as good. But the sans serif is better for labeled and short text. So which one should you be using as you prepare your remote presentation? Unless you're doing it wrong, you shouldn't be having big blocks of text that cover your screen. It should be mostly small blurbs, single or 2 sentences. And in that case, probably a sans serif font is probably the one you want to use. All right, what else can we say about good figures? How about this one? I think that this is a good figure. What is good about this? Well, for one thing, you can easily see that it's 2 different data sets. You've got blue and orange. These things, even colorblind people can tell them apart. You know there's 2 data sets because one is a solid line and one's orange line. One's broken and one's solid. And so you can see them easily. They've got them labeled nicely. You can see the axes are labeled nicely as well, so you know what's being plotted against what. And you've even got nice tick marks that make it easy to read off values here without too much work. Another thing that's nice about this, you'll notice that it's plotted as 5 inches right now, but because we're scientists, most of the time we present in 2-column journals. So the data gets split into these 2 columns. Your figure gets shrunk down to 3 inches. And you should be aware of that, because if it looks great when you make it all blown up huge on your computer, it may be hard to read when it gets shrunk down to a 2-column format. So here's the same figure, but in a 2-column format. This is still pretty easy to read. You can still read all this data pretty well. Okay. Now, one way to make this better is to make square figures. If you don't like square figures, that's fine, but they do have an pretty tough to deny advantage that when you shrink them down, once it has to get down shrunk to 3 inches here, you have more real estate vertically to work with by using square aspect ratio figures, okay? Or at least taller than they are shorter. All right, now let's compare this to a bad figure. Believe it or not, this is the exact same figure, the same data, just plotted with another software. Anybody recognize this software? It's actually a pretty common one. So this software comes from Maple. It's a, in my mind, infamous math software that you can plot things with. But what blows my mind is we didn't try and make that figure awful. That is exactly how it comes. Let's take a look at this. So what's wrong with this figure? The exact same data, 2 data sets. First off, it's red and green. So that is colorblind problematic. And you might say, well, I'm not colorblind, so it doesn't matter. And how common is it? It's actually very common, more so with men than women. Men, I think it's like 8%. Somebody can fact check me while we're doing this, but it is an incredibly high fraction of males are colorblind. So thinking about colorblindness is important, and red and green is not going to cut it. Also, the stroke, the thickness of these lines is very thin. It becomes kind of hard to see. And then this drives me crazy. They've got this giant label here, but their tick labels are quite small, right? And then here, you've got this really big tick spacing, but you've got this tiny tick spacing. There's just no consistency to this. And then imagine how much worse it's going to get by the time you shrink this down to a 3-inch column, to a 2-column format, right? Again, the exact same data plotted with 2 different, one with care and one with the default settings out of a common software platform. So my suggestion is that you think about some of these things. Even if you don't adopt all the things I'm suggesting today, at least start thinking about your figure and not just generating it in Excel, heaven forbid, and slopping it into your paper without any more thought. Think about the person who's going to read and interact with it. All right. Another thing I'd like to suggest is that you choose a few well-selected colors. This is a figure that came from Danny Beatty's thesis presentation when she defended her thesis last year. She did a wonderful job. This color palette comes from the Python library. It's from the Seaborn library in the Python programming language called Rocket. It's beautiful. All the way through her talk, she had the same color palette everywhere. It was consistent. It was really nice. And it's no more difficult than using the default setting in Excel. You just have to select it and select one that's nice. They have lots of other options, though. These are all Python color palettes you can choose. This is Rocket, the one that you just saw. This is a diverging palette called VLAG, and this is a high contrast palette called Deep. But you've also got cube helix patterns, and these can just make some really compelling images. Something that has become just sort of blah to look at can become engaging and interesting to look at. Take this one, for example. From a recent paper, here's a figure that we prepared. What I was really trying to show, again, it's important that you think about what's the message you're trying to portray. And the message I was trying to portray is that we should care about the historic nature of elemental production, because things can happen, like civil wars, that might mess up that production. So how am I going to illustrate that point? I do it in this figure. In this figure, we're showing the market share of cobalt production. And then here's the end of the Congo War, the Second Civil War. So in this region over here, it was during the Civil War. And you can see that Congo's neighbor, the DRC's neighbor, Zambia, totally took over their mines. This is well known. This has been written about. And then when the end of the war ended, you see Congo slowly increase and take back its market fraction while Zambia decreases. So you've got these other countries which are not as important. And so by placing Zambia and Congo at the 2 endpoints, it's easy to see their change relative to one another while still including this other information. And you do so with a really nice color palette, which again, was no more difficult than using like the standard. Like none of this is harder than Excel. You type a program once in Python and then you continue to use it with slight modifications. All right, what else can we say? I would suggest that we all rethink the way that we've been doing insets. What is an inset? It's this tiny figure inside the figure. You've all seen them. You've all hopefully used them and done so effectively. There's good ways to do it. What's great about this figure? Well, take a look at like the font size. It's consistent all the way throughout. You can read everything everywhere, okay? Notice what they've done with their data to make it even more redundant. They've got open, unfilled, so they've got squares and they're open, they're not filled. Here you've got circles that are filled. They've got the dotted versus the solid line. They've really been bending over backwards to make sure that you can tell these 2 data sets apart. But a potentially, I think, a better way to present your data when you have something where you're normally going to be using an inset is instead to do a multi-panel plot. So what's a multi-panel plot? We've shown you one already, but here's another one. Here you have something on the x-axis, which is a common label. They could be the same numbers or different, it's fine. And then you've got two different y labels. By plotting them like this, the exact same data becomes much more easy to interpret. And then you can do things like the one I showed you earlier, where we had 4 or 5 different measurements all collapsed on top of each other with the same common x-axis, okay? What you don't want to do is what I think many probably people have done is you make 2 figures, you scale them however you want them, and then you just shrink this one to fill the white space. The problem with that is that this now becomes essentially invisible. You can't read that at all, especially by the time you shrink that down to a 3-column format. So I really suggest that we don't do that, okay? Next, let's talk about instruments and plots we get directly from instruments. You might have an aging piece of equipment in your lab. I had some when I was a PhD student. And sure enough, when I went to use these, sometimes you couldn't actually get the XY data. It only gave you a figure. And we didn't make this up. This is an actual output from a UV-Vis spectrometer. And it's awful. So what's terrible about this? Well, for one thing, I think the most unforgivable thing about this is that when you use UV-Vis data, you want to find these peaks and you want to label them as happening at a certain value. But because they don't even have tick marks here, you don't know where that's occurring at. Like, that's a complete disaster of a plot, in my opinion, for that reason alone. But there's other problems with this. They haven't labeled what's on the y-axis. You don't know what the units are or what they're trying to present there. You have no idea. Here on the x-axis, they're showing you wave number cm-1. That should be inverse centimeters, but they just got lazy in preparing this. So, so what do you do if this is what your instrument spits out and you can't get the XY data? Well, you can correct it yourself. You're going to do it manually. Here's how you do it. You take your figure and then you go to a piece of software called Web Plot Digitizer. If you know me, you've heard me talk about this already. It's phenomenal software. It's free to use. You don't even have to download anything. It runs in your browser in Chrome or whatever, and it's beautiful. Let me show you an example. You take this, you paste your figure, you tell it what the 2 points on the x-axis and 2 points on the y-axis, and then it will automatically grab, using color and algorithms that are easy to use, all the data, in this case along the blue line. It's grabbing data points every 10 pixels. So I did this just recently for my class, for my first homework. I wanted to show an EDS spectra, and here's the data I found in literature. So that was the actual data I took from the paper, and I could have just copied and pasted that. And I think all of us have done that before. We've taken, when we're comparing our results to somebody else's, we'll just copy theirs and put ours next to it. And they don't look the same, and theirs looks really bad because you copied it from a PDF that had been like downsized and increased, and it just isn't the right way to do it. It's not much harder to run this through Web Plot Digitizer. Here's the exact same data. I just ran it through Web Plot Digitizer and grabbed the red data set and then replotted it in Python. The whole thing took me maybe 5 minutes. It was very simple to do, and you get a much better set of your data. So you can do the same thing with instruments that don't give you your data, but give you a printout. All right, let's talk about micrographs. I think many of us will use micrographs when we present. You've got lots of options here. I mean, this is a very standard figure you might see in a paper anywhere. You see it's an SEM micrograph, and they're probably trying to say something about the structure here, maybe the pore size. And yet what's hard to read is the information that would tell you that, right? You've got all this extra stuff down here, right? The accelerating voltage, the spot size, the working distance, magnification. How often do you actually need that data? Unless your paper is about the microscopy technique itself, you almost never need that data. And if you do, then put it in the methods section. It doesn't need to be there in the figure where it's noise, right? There's the signal, which is you're trying to tell them something, and then there's noise, and that just becomes noise. So what do I suggest you do is replot this, first off square, so it shrinks nicely, and then to draw your own scale bar here. By drawing your own scale bar and labeling it very clearly, all of a sudden your viewer can easily say, oh, okay, the pore size is something on the order of a micron here, which is much more useful than what they had prepared in the as outputted figure from the machine. All right, what else can we say? Here's another example of a nice figure. Again, this is an example of a multi-panel plot. It's taller than it is wide, so it's going to shrink nicely. And then check this out. They've done a heat map here. When do you use heat maps? Heat maps are really effective for condensing a lot of information, three-dimensional information in a two-dimensional space. So here they've done X-ray diffraction at many different temperatures, and instead of showing you hundreds of different two-dimensional X-ray diffractograms, they made a heat map, right? Where the more red the color, the higher the intensity, and the more blue the color, the lower the intensity. So right away you can see that at this temperature, about 40 K, it transitions, its X-ray diffraction changes. And to make that even clearer, look what they've done on the left and on the right. They've shown you the two-dimensional X-ray diffractograms on the end members, so you can really tell the difference quite easily. And then you've got the heat map in between. Now notice they've also taken 2 other measurements that aren't diffraction, and they coincide with that point. So they're really, the point of this paper is again to say something's happening at 40 Kelvin, and this figure is doing a really good job of making that point across, okay? Let's look at another one. How about this one? Here's a figure where they're doing a DFT calculation, I believe, and they're showing you the energy density of states, where instead of just a bunch of black lines all looking the same, they're showing you the density states coming from each of the different orbitals, which is really helpful, I think. How about this one? Table of content graphics. Table of content graphics are becoming more and more not just popular, but necessary. When you submit a paper, they want to put a little graphic next to your title that will grab people's attention. And so the temptation is to do something really easy because you already worked on this paper enough, and it's the last thing you want to do is add more effort to that. But I would caution you against doing something too cheesy, unless you want to end up on Ruffle TOC, which you haven't heard of. Look it up. tocruffle.tumblr.com is a funny website where they take awful table of content graphics and show you how bad they look. Here's an example of a really nice one. This comes from Kim C's group at Caltech. Here she's showing something during the lithiation process of, I think it's a cathode for lithium-ion batteries. As you add lithium, she's showing what's happening to the structure and inferring something about the mechanism of how lithium can come in and out of the structure. You're condensing the entire thought of the paper into one little tiny cartoon graphic. Now, because these are small, and I'm talking really small, it'll give you dimensions. Every journal's different, but they're typically on the scale of inches. You can't do really small text because it's going to get shrunk too far. So I think this text is even too small. You want to do really large, easy to read text to go along with your figure. Okay, that's your table of content graphic. What else? This is a nice example of microscopy. Here they're showing you things at different length scales. The whole point of this paper, they could have shown you 3 separate images, one zoomed out, one zoomed in medium, and one way zoomed in. But instead, they're just trying to make a message that there's a hierarchical change in the crystal structure. So take a look what they've done. You've got panel A, again, it's a square plot, so it's going to shrink nicely. You've got panel A, which shows you zoomed out at 100 nanometers. Panel B zooms in, and you can see that there's these 2 different regions that were present in the larger one, and they've labeled them HH and FH. Their figure caption has to say what HH and FH are, or they've not done their job. So you need to make that clear there. Then they've zoomed in further, and they've done a selected area diffraction, which proves how they know that one's a half Heusler and one's a full Heusler in this case. Again, it's a really nice job of a figure that's taking multiple different length scales and collapsing it into one well-done figure. How about this one? If you are a material scientist, chances are you're going to work with crystal structures. So learn how to use the software to draw these things. You don't have to just like Google image, take the first thing that pops up. You shouldn't do that. These things are easy to do. This I generated with Vesta. Vesta is a free software for drawing crystal structures. It's not that hard to use. If you got questions, send me an email and I will send you a link to my tutorials on it, but it's pretty simple. And it makes it easy to talk about the crystal chemistry, which might be driving the mechanism for whatever property you're describing. Okay, so I could go on and on, but those are some of the things I wanted to cover on nice figures. How are we doing on time? We're at 4:40. So let's talk about how, at least in my opinion, to be a dynamic public speaker. Bring this back over here. I think that we should actually give some thought to the way that we're presenting things. And part of that is going to be preparing slides that aid you in what you're trying to get across. So let's see some examples. The challenge is this. You've all been working for however long, maybe the last year before you've been since the last time you were at a conference, which means you've got tons of work that you did, and then they give you a 15-minute talk slot. And then remember that includes 2 or 3 minutes because the person before you went over, and then 2 or 3 minutes for question and answer, and then 2 or 3 minutes to get your laptop plugged in and get it working. Like, you really don't have that long. And so you need to really compress and edit and revise the amount of what you thought you were going to present into something that is the core message that you want them to come away with, right? So that's the challenge. So how do we do that? One thing I like to do right off the bat, and I always do this when I present now, is the very first slide. So my first slide is usually something eye-catching, a funny comic, a big interesting picture, an interesting question you could pose them. That's the one that has your name on it. So while you're waiting for them to do the introduction, you've already given them something that primes them for the talk that you're going to be giving. But the second slide, the second thing I do is always my acknowledgments, because I don't want to run out of time at the end. So the very next thing I'll say is, before I dive into my talk, I'll say, you know, these are the people that made this talk possible. I didn't do this work alone. Many people helped me make this happen, and also many funding agencies. By doing that right in the beginning, it takes 10 seconds, but you guarantee that you've recognized it and you won't run out of time and forget it at the end. So I think you should do that, especially if you've done something with a lot of people. It's helpful to say, like, look, these people made this possible. This guy did this one did this, and I'm going to present on this different aspect, so they know what your contribution was as well. Okay. Another thing I suggest people do is to simplify plots into just the important components. I've seen this plot so many times. It comes from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And what it's showing you is where energy is coming from and where it's going. But even as I'm talking, you're not listening anymore, because it is such an interesting, it's interesting for one thing, but it's also complex, and there's tiny numbers and there's lines going everywhere. You stopped listening to me because you're trying to make sense of this visual, spaghetti thing in front of you. So what I suggest you do is think about why you're showing that figure. People show that, at least in the field of thermoelectrics, to say, right here, they say, look at all this rejected energy. We should be caring about that and not just other things like generating new energy from green sources. We should be worrying about the waste heat, right? So if that's your message, then replot the figure. You don't have to use it like you got it. You can redo it yourself. So that's what I've done here. I've taken that same exact figure, but I've replotted it into just the stuff that I want to portray. I say, yes, it's important that we stop using fossil fuels. It's important that we grow the renewable sector, but equally important is to think about when we use this energy, most of it's turning into waste heat. And then I would usually follow it with some sort of statistic, like if you captured 1% of that waste heat, it would be, I think at the time when I prepared that figure, it was 9 times what we're getting from solar photovoltaics. So now I've got people interested, and I didn't completely lose them with a figure that they were more interested in than what I had to say about the figure, which is not what you want, okay? So the other thing is to think about how long people can pay attention for. This talk's been going for 33 minutes, and I'm sure that some of you are already like, when will this end? We just don't want to pay attention to things for very long. And so if you were to plot the fraction of people paying attention in a normal classroom over time, what do you think it would look like? I usually have people draw this, and I see lots of different answers. Here's what studies have shown. When they actually track students paying attention over time, this is one really old study. And this time the professor was like, he would occasionally look back at the classroom and be like, who's paying attention? And so he was just like, it's not very quantitative, but at least it was something. Now they've gotten more quantitative. They do clicker studies, and they can show that when they do a clicker, people pay attention, and then they rapidly fall off. And we're talking 2-3 minutes, and students are no longer paying attention. Now let me ask you this. What do you think that plot would look like now with a virtual presentation? How long do you pay attention before you're on another website or checking your email or who knows what else? It's probably not very long. And we're all just, this isn't like me scolding any of you. I'm just as bad at this. So what it means is that as a speaker, you have to constantly recapture attention. Jumping from slide to video is one helpful way to do that, but there's lots of other things you can do because not just students, but all people just don't pay attention for very long. They're going to be sleeping through your lecture. So how do you capture attention? One great way to do it is to use images and questions for your audience. Here I'm showing a beautiful picture of Salt Lake City, except that it's showing the inversion, right? And so I might start this with a question. I might show that big picture and then ask the question, be like, who's traveled to Utah in the winter? And people might say yes or no. I'd be like, did you know that our air gets gross in Utah? And this would segue to me saying something about the need for renewable energy or changing the way that we, whatever it is, it would segue to my talk, but you capture attention with a compelling image or the question. How about this question? Even those who live in Utah and have seen this, I could say, do you know what the origin is of cold pool inversion? Like, why does it happen? And people are interested. If you ask them something they don't know about, they're going to be more likely to pay attention than not, okay? So that's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is you can use analogies and examples to other fields. A big part of my research has to do with materials informatics, which is using machine learning and applying it towards data science. So I could show them this. I could be like, look, 10 years ago, the Obama White House said this was important and we started working on it. But you don't care about that. Like, that meant nothing to you. But if I relate it to something that you're familiar with, the odds of you caring about it go way up. Like, for example, I will often say this. I'll say, materials informatics does the same thing that Netflix and Amazon and Google Translate do when they make predictions about what show you're going to watch or what product you're going to want to buy or how to translate this language. But we take that same idea of machine learning, learning from data and applying it towards something, and we apply it towards materials research. And all of a sudden you can kind of get the idea of what we're doing. We're training from existing data and we're making future predictions. I love to start, again, I said my starting slide, this was one from 2015. I sent a student to the Boston MRS meeting and I had him start with this, like this was his starting slide. Why did I like this? Because it was November in Boston and outside looked a lot like this. People could relate with it. So when he's going to talk about cold temperature performance of phase change materials for lithium-ion batteries, it was really easy for him to say like, hey, who here has tried to start their car in the winter and noticed that it almost doesn't start? And everyone is already like, yeah, that's happened to me. They can relate with this. It makes it really easy for him to motivate his research and say like, we're here to try and fix this. We have phase change materials that hopefully will keep your battery warm, and blah, blah, blah. And he launches into it, right? So I think that using effective images is really helpful. Another thing you can do is vary the tone and volume of your voice. If you're like me, you love to listen to podcasts. And one of the reasons I love podcasts is a lot of times these speakers have excellent communication skills. They know when to get loud and excited about something, and they know when to get quiet and thoughtful and introspective. So consider yourself next time you give a talk practicing a few times, and try be over the top a few times. Like try to do something really excited or really quiet, and then try and mix it. You should be practicing your talk anyways, and introducing some of this dynamic volume and varying to your tone of your voice is overall going to be an effective strategy to get people to pay attention a little bit better. What else can we do? I love the idea of presenting an unexpected statistic, quote, or statement. Like this one came from Nest, I think it was, or I can't remember who this came from, but he was arguing that a bad meeting costs between $50,000 and $100,000 in salaries. And so a bad meeting actually has a huge cost. And his whole point is like, here, our software helps you have better meetings. And whether you believe it or not, a controversial or an interesting statistic is going to capture attention. So in your field, I imagine there's some sort of statistic that you could pull up that would capture people's attention, right? So those are useful to do. What else can we do though? Again, if they're not going to take many notes from this presentation, I hope that you'll write this down. Every time you prepare a slide, it should have one message, and you should write that message at the top in full sentence. You should never have at the top of your slide results or like conclusion. I just don't think that's very helpful. Or, like X-ray diffraction of sample. Like they know it's an X-ray diffraction pattern. They're looking at it with you. Instead of giving it some useless title, make the title the takeaway message and write it right at top. You've noticed I've been doing that. Look at these last slides. Present an unexpected statistic, quote, or statement. I'm telling you my takeaway message. What's helpful about this is it tells me when I go to my next slide, I know exactly what I'm supposed to say. When I move to the slide, I'm supposed to say, hey, you should also vary the tone and volume of your voice. That's the whole point of me showing this slide. And by writing it right up front and top, it makes it really easy to make the message clear. And then have your images or data to support that one message. If you've got 5 or 6 messages you want to get across, break them up into 5 or 6 slides. Don't do them all in one thing, with very few exceptions. Like for example on here, if this was my data, what would be the slide title for this? Well, it depends on what I'm trying to get across. What's the message I'm trying to convey to my audience? If this is in a grant proposal, my message would probably be along the lines of like, we're generating way more data than we're currently using, and it's only going to increase. We should start using data science, right? Because I'm showing number of publications versus year. So the slide might have the title along the lines of, it might say something like, there's exponential growth in the amount of data available, right? A simple one-sentence takeaway that describes what you're showing them. Okay, so I suggest doing this and not ever saying things like introduction or motivation or whatever. Just tell them what you're doing. Another thing I would suggest you do is if you have a complicated process, maybe you're doing, I've seen people in chemical engineering describe different processes for getting to some reactant, and it's like 20 steps long, and they show like the reactor, and I'm just lost, and I'm not listening to them anymore because I'm trying to figure out what on earth I'm looking at because it's too complicated. Consider simplifying it with a really simple cartoon schematic. Here's what I've done for a data mining project. In the data mining, there was a lot more that went here, but this was the key steps. We started from the literature. We extracted that data into a database. We built a user interface. We did some parameter selection, and then we built a visualization tool. This made it much easier to describe a really complicated process in a way that everyone in 5 seconds now understands roughly kind of what the goal, at least, of what we did was. I would say that you should use shortcut URLs if you want your audience to remember them. So you saw that I did this with the, with the Jean-Luc Doumont YouTube link, tiny.cc/Doumont. I did the same thing here when I went to a conference. I wanted people to use this tool that we had built. It was an online tool. So I said, hey, rather than trying to write down the whole URL, just write down tiny.cc/datamine. You make sure that that link works ahead of time, and you share that instead. You can do the same thing that redirects to your group research homepage or your Google Scholar profile. You can select whatever link you want to have it direct to, but people will be able to write that down much more easily than the URL or the DOI of some paper that you just wrote, okay? Other things you can do is, if you're gonna use equations, I would not use the inherent equation editor because they will often fail. Instead, I would save them. I'd create them and then save them as an image, and the odds of them being there when you need them are more likely. And then, more generally speaking, don't use equations when you present. Put those in your paper. You should use equations only when you have to when you present. So if you can think of a scenario where you can't describe it simply with words, you could put it there. But if you show an equation, you have to go term by term what it means, or you will lose people 9 times out of 10. There might be the one expert in the room that knows it and is going to be nodding his head or his or her head along with you, but most people will be lost. So I really suggest not using equations where possible. All right. If you must show a complicated figure, I recommend pacing your audience. What do I mean by that? You don't have to show the entire figure all at once. Like here, what I was talking about in this scenario was crustal abundance. So it's a topic related to like material scarcity and abundance, which most material scientists don't ever think about, let alone understand what that is. So if I would just dove right in and show them the data, they wouldn't know what HHI means or what this symbol means. They'd have no idea. So instead, I show them first the axes. I say, here I'm plotting scarcity against HHI. I'll describe HHI in a minute, and you know what scarcity is. Here I've shown some lines that represent how scarce things are, from the common like titanium to the rare like platinum. And all of a sudden you can follow north to south what's happening on this figure. And then I'd go to the next one. I'd say, now what about the x-axis? Here is plotting HHI. HHI is a measure of the monopoly on the production of something, cars or whatever else. So what you don't want is to be over here in the monopoly region. The red region defined by the Federal Trade Commission would be a monopoly here. This would be kind of a monopoly, and this would not be very bad at all. So you'd love to have over here in this corner, both low scarcity and not a monopoly. Now, when I've talked about this, I still think people don't quite follow me when I've described HHI. So I usually do an analogy to something they do know. This is what I would typically do. I'd then say, let me show you an analogy. When we talk about monopoly of production, think about computer operating systems. It's mostly Apple and Google with a tiny, you brave few soldiers out there using Linux, right? Or about search engines. It's mostly Google with a little bit of Bing and Yahoo and whoever knows whatever else. But by the time you get to like the car industry, it's a very diverse market. And then I would say something about why that's a good thing. I'd say, you know, Fiat goes out of business. There's a few sad Italians, but most of us are like, Fiat was a car company? Like, we didn't know. So if you're buying your materials from a company that is the only company that makes it, that's not a good thing because you're vulnerable to them changing their mind on a whim, right? That was my whole point here. And now that I've explained the axes, only then do I show them the data on top of this, which in this case, I'm showing them thermoelectric performance, where larger circles are better than smaller circles. And then I would say, we'd like to be down here rather than up here, but most of the best materials are in a bad spot. We maybe should pay attention to these oxides because they're not that terrible and they're much more available and low cost, right? So that was my whole argument with a complicated figure like that. But you notice that when I showed that to you, I paced it. I showed it section by section to make sure that you could follow along easily. Next up, I would say that videos can do a whole lot more than static figures. Like when I'm talking about here I'm showing a gecko, how it can't climb on Teflon because it's so low friction, right? Low coefficient of friction, which in this case, I was talking about making blood dialysis tubing out of PTFE instead of PVA, which is what they were made of, and why that would be advantageous because the proteins can't stick to it. So by showing that, you've already caught their attention. Here's another example. We were talking about electrochromics. You could show just a couple slides of this, but why not show the image of it changing? When I say it changes quickly and you see in real time how quick that changes, all of a sudden it's much easier. And also when I say that you can mask it and make like letters appear, that becomes much easier to interpret when you've seen the video than me just describing it. Because I could describe that, but it's really not that hard to use videos. And in 2020, there's no excuse not to use them where possible. What else can we do? Incorporate videos demonstrations. I'm probably going to skip this one. How about this one? Using narratives and stories. We're almost out of time, but something that you can do really effectively. Notice this is a big block of text, which I'm normally very against putting a big block of text on a slide. If you do it, then you should read it for them. You would all read this together. That way they're not trying to read it and listen to you at the same time. And in this case, I think I was trying to talk about this protein loss during dialysis. And so I read an excerpt from a doctor who talks about how horrible it is, how he's treated dialysis patients his whole life. And then when he experiences it and he sees the protein loss and how tired and awful that makes you feel, it was a great motivator for why we should care about not losing these proteins by them sticking to the tubes, which is the whole point of our research in that instance, okay? Another thing is to show the history of something. It's always helpful to remind people what's happened historically. In this case, we were talking about hemodialysis, and I just showed them the very first tool that was ever built, and you can remind them that happened under interesting circumstances. So capture their attention with some interesting bit of history if it's possible. I'm gonna skip this. I would say to use body language appropriately. This guy is, you know, I love what he's doing for science and technology, but he is an awful public speaker, very uncomfortable. You know what he reminds me of is this person right here. Ricky Bobby, who doesn't know what to do with his hands. And they're like, oh, you can just keep your hands down now. So when you're presenting, if you can't control your hands, if they're doing the same thing as Ricky Bobby here, put them behind you and hold them, right? You can hold them behind you if you have to, or at least like control them in a way that, and it's better to have them hidden behind you than to be doing what's going on here. Okay, we're just about out of time. So I think that I will actually close here and take any questions. So I'm going to, feel free to unmute yourselves. And if you've got questions or anything, feel free to voice, just start talking and we'll answer questions now.
Dr. Sparks, I don't have any question, but I loved your setup to keep your laptop on your eye-to-eye label. I love that.
Thank you. And again, this doesn't have to be super expensive. The one thing I wish I wasn't sweating like crazy, I'm out in my shed because I do have 4 kids and a dog, and I had to find the only quiet spot around. But I mean, find a good spot for you to present, and you don't need to spend any money. I didn't spend any real money to make this setup. You can make your space work as well.
Yeah, it is really good to see that.
Well, what else? Are there any questions I can answer from anybody?
I have a question.
Not me, I don't think so.
Professor, I have a question. Is it possible to give this presentation, or we just need to make notes?
Yeah, I knew that a couple of my students weren't going to be able to be here, so I've recorded this. I think I started recording just a couple minutes late, so it won't start at the exact beginning, but I did record it, and I'll throw it on YouTube with an unlisted link, just unlisted, so you have to have the link to find it, and I'll put that in the group on the Canvas page in the announcement, so you'll see that in the next day or two.
Thanks.
Anything else? Any other questions I can answer for anybody?
Hi. Can you just go one more time, just show that slide where you use Zoom and different programs on the left and right,
Yes.
and you're switching back and forth so fast.
Yep. Let me go back to that. Give me just 1 second. Okay, 1 second. Almost found it here. Okay. So the key, Raj, if you want to be able to switch back and forth like this, the default Zoom camera, like when you have, like, for example, you have your video turned on right now, you want to turn that off, and instead you'll go down to, let me go to the next slide, I'll show you. Right here, see where I have this presentation option? If you select that, it will give you options like share your screen, or if you click advanced, it will go to, maybe I can show you actually, let me, what if I can do this? Do you guys see this right here? Yeah. So the basic function will just say like share my screen or like a whiteboard or just my camera, but you can click advanced and you can do show a portion of my screen. And that's what I've been doing this whole time. And so the green portion you see here, you can move this, make it as large or small as you want. And so in order to flip back and forth between these, you put your slides down. So put the green box so it covers your slide exactly. And then put your video right on top of that. So that way when you hold down Alt and press Tab, you can just switch between the two like I'm doing right now. Just by Alt Tab, I came back to my video away from my PowerPoint slides. Does that make sense?
Right, yeah, so 3 or 4 programs, if it's running, I should bring it to that box, okay.
That's right.
Yeah, got it.
Anything else I can explain to anybody?
Hi, Dr. Sparks. I had a couple questions actually, or I guess just one question.
Yeah, go ahead, Hayden.
Is there a preference for kind of the, I guess the seriousness or the kind of situation in terms of how you're presenting? So for example, if we're doing like a master's thesis presentation, it'd make more sense for the whole presentation to be concise and, you know, very well made. But is there other situations where it's acceptable to provide other information beforehand? Kind of like maybe like a condensed poster or something to the group before you present?
Really, really a great question. It totally depends on where you're presenting and who your audience is, right? So I'm showing this slide here because this guy on the far left is one of the most like confident people I've ever met in my entire life. He went to the fall MRS meeting, and when he went to the poster session, he had this hot pink jacket on. He's got this giant walrus mustache, and he was wearing those sandals that your toes fit inside of, like the little toesy ones, with like a nice button-up shirt. Like he looked ridiculous is what our postdoc advisor said, but he was memorable. So, I mean, there's a line to be drawn between being memorable and being not an embarrassment to your PhD advisor,
Yeah.
right? And so when in doubt, talk to other people and get some opinions. Ask your PhD advisor. And then it depends on the presentation, right? At a poster symposium, at a big meeting like that, you can be a little bit more informal. But if you're defending your master's thesis, it's a much more formal event. So you wouldn't have extraneous information or anecdotes as much as you would have the raw data, right? But if you're doing a group meeting, say in my group meeting, we actually mandate it. We require a Taylor mission where in the middle of the presentation, they have an intermission where they say something unrelated to their work that's nevertheless interesting. So I think that it's a case-by-case basis, and I hope that you'll find a balance there between being memorable and interesting and engaging, but not being inappropriate.
Okay.
Same thing
Perfect.
with jokes.
Thank you.
I will sometimes start talks with a joke, and I had one about data science, and it was borderline not okay. And I when in doubt, I run it past my wife, and I say, "Is this like something I can say?" And she'll say yes or no. So
Okay.
find that sounding board for you in your life.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, during this semester, I expect you to present differently than you've ever presented. I want you to actually put some time and thought into the mechanics of having like a good setup, good lighting, good camera angle and that. Spend some time on that. But more importantly, I think more importantly, think about presenting in a way that you've actually thought about who it is you're talking to, what you want them to come away with, and how you're going to most effectively do that. Okay? I look forward to this semester with all. Okay, we will see you guys next week.
I have a quick question. So this write-up, are you just going to post an announcement about it on Canvas, or how do we know what we're supposed to write about and where to submit it and stuff?
Good question, Conrad. I'm going to make an assignment on Canvas. So the assignment will be the write-up for presentation of week 1. And it can be just a half page. That's fine. Something really short just to show that you were here and paid some sort of attention. Okay?
Sounds good.
All right. We'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.